Will Rishi Sunak survive until the next general election? The Daily Telegraph is after him, Simon Clarke is after him, and now a former advisor to the PM is apparently part of a group of Tories who are after him too. Would the Conservatives really give us our fourth Prime Minister in 2 years? The BBC has been in the news again, accused of bias, although the Culture Minister struggled to give any examples of the Beebs' impartiality in a really embarrassing interview with Skys Kay Burley. I'll be asking our former BBC man if he thinks his former bosses have gone all woke. And across the pond, Donald Trump, 99 indictments and all, looks a cert for the Republican nomination. What will that mean for the UK and geopolitics if he goes on and wins the presidency? Welcome to the latest episode of the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just a bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Welcome to the second episode of the Downtown Den Politics Podcast of 2024. It's me, Frank McKenna, the Chief Executive and Group Chairman of Downtown in Business, joined as always by the absolutely fantastic, superb, wonderful, knowledgeable political guru that is Jim Hancock. Jim, of course, former BBC Northwest political editor, indeed was for a time the political editor within Westminster of the BBC. What he doesn't know about politics. Oh, no, he wasn't. He's nodding his head. No, he wasn't. Well, he should have been the BBC man in Westminster. And I tell you, nobody knows more about the ins and outs of the political environment in which we are currently going through than our man, Jim. So, James, I've asked the question, is Rishi Sunak in serious trouble? And this is on the back of a couple of things happening since the turn of the year. Obviously, there was this huge poll conducted by the Daily Telegraph, or conducted by YouGov, featured on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, but commissioned by a group of very wealthy Tories. Of course, this poll showed that the Tories would be wiped out. Keir Starmer would be Prime Minister with a landslide victory. General election was called tomorrow. We then had that followed up in the same day's newspaper of the Telegraph with an article from the former Brexit Minister, Lord Frost, calling on Sunak to shape up or ship out. This week, Simon Clarke in the same newspaper, not Sir Simon Clarke, former cabinet minister. I think he represents a northeast seat. He again wrote an article for the Telegraph suggesting that Sunak should resign. And now it emerges that one of his former advisors has set up a group which is trying to do Mr. Sunak in. Right, James, are the Tories seriously going to give us our fourth Prime Minister in the space of 2 years?
I don't think so, but I'm really shocked and surprised that Simon Clarke decided to do this. I've generally sort of tracked Simon Clarke's career, and I know he served under Liz Truss, which is now a badge of shame. But in his previous incarnation, working in the Treasury, I think, with Rishi Sunak as Chancellor, he was seemed to me to be quite a reasonable, sort of steady guy. So I was really surprised that he should do this, because the idea of a fourth change since 2019 is risible. The Conservative Party are already heavily damaged by these changes of leadership without any recourse to the voters. And the idea of doing it again, I would have thought nobody could contemplate it. But something is going on. You've very expertly outlined what looks a bit like a strategy. Publication of that poll, which I think we discussed last week and was the subject of my blog a couple of weeks ago, saying there'd be this Tory Labour landslide of Blairite proportions. No one's really got to the bottom of who funded it, but it was just before the Rwanda vote, and it was widely seen as an attempt to shock the rebel Tories into voting down the bill. I was down at Westminster this week, and there is widespread anger amongst the Spartans that there was an hour-long meeting before that Rwanda vote where the 60-odd rebels were in the room, and Robert Jenrick, the former Home Office minister who resigned over this issue, came out looking like thunder because he realised that at the last minute only a small group were going to go along with it. So we always have this big talk, small reality situation. If I may briefly say this finally in answer to your question, I think there's four. Been put to me, there's four groups of Conservatives. I mean, we know there are five, or I think there's even six families
six now.
There are Tories who are basically fatalists. One or two of them have already left the House of Commons to go off and take jobs outside, which I think is deeply insulting to the voters. Fatalists who just think the game's up and they just go through the motions in the next few months and then lose office. There's a group that obviously hope that something is going to turn up, which I think is, in a sense, the most interesting, because you and I have already discussed in some detail my not nervousness. I don't have any skin in this game, but nervousness on behalf of the Labour Party that the economy could pick up and something could turn up. Heaven knows the international situation could blow up and people rush to the Conservative Party, perceiving them to be the government of the day. You know, I mean, I was at the. Sorry, I'm giving you a very long answer. Shut me up if you want to. I was at what's called a huddle after Prime Minister's questions in the lower gallery of the House of Commons. This is where the Prime Minister's spokesman is. And there was quite a lot of talk, some of it fairly lighthearted, some of it slightly more serious, about even contemplating a war with Russia and whether we should have conscription and things like that. I mean, the fact that that's even being talked about, you know, so the international situation could blow up. Then there's those that would like to get rid of Sunak, but think that it wouldn't work, you know, that there'd be a vote of confidence and no damage Sunak would hobble on. And then we've got this small group of people who think that the situation is so desperate that there needs to be a change. I think the only thing that could get that group going is, and it was been put to me this week, conceivably in Wellingborough, Reform UK, who are putting up an Asian gentleman who used to be a member of the European Parliament for Reform UK. If they came in second place we think Labour are going to take the seat. If Reform beat the Tories into third place, the position might change. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's important though, Jim, to put the whole issue into context, because it's ordinarily a big issue to get rid of your Prime Minister, but the Tories seem to get rid of Prime Ministers the way Everton do football managers. So perhaps it's not as big a deal these days, but it certainly used to be. And, you know, on the back of the Daily Telegraph, which appears to me to have gone rogue as far as the government is concerned, and this consistent campaign and features, as I say, against him, first from Lord Frost on the back of that poll, then Sir Simon Clarke, who knows what is in store next week. It then emerges that Will Dry, who was a special advisor responsible for polling and opinion research at Number 10, he resigned back in November, and he's reported to have joined a group of Conservatives who, as I say, are looking to replace Sunak. So I do think there is something in this. And you've mentioned the by-elections. Well, you've mentioned one by-election. There will be several, of course, over the next few months. And then we've got the May local elections and mayoral elections. And I would suggest that if he does badly in all of those, then there would be a serious challenge. What do you reckon to that?
The pressure would build, but, you know, well, let's take the scenario through, you know, that they're certainly expected to lose Kingswood and Wellingborough. And then we come to the local elections. Labour are in a very strong position. These local elections this May are largely in the metropolitan areas where Labour's more or less won everything that it can. So the opportunity for big headlines for Labour gains isn't that great. I mean, as we've previously discussed, there'll be a huge significance in whether Andy Street can hang on as mayor of the West Midlands and Ben Houchin as mayor of Teesside. Take the case that the swings are really bad in May. You're then facing shortening time before the election has to happen, and that comes into play as well. A new untried prime minister coming into office. I mean, the question would be, once again, could it be done quickly? And then you run the, if someone's just going to come forward and it's not going to be taken to the Conservative Party members, then that's an even more undemocratic coronation. If you take it to the party members, we all remember what happened last time that happened. You got Liz Truss.
You might get Liz Truss again. I would suggest, Jim, that if the results are catastrophic, and we can't say that they're going to be, but it's potentially going to happen. Listen, Jeremy Hunt's got his budget on the 6th of March. That may turn things around a little for the government. You've then got an economic situation that is a movable feast. That might turn things around for the government if we get more positive news on interest rates and inflation. You then, as you say, have got a whole range of things happening on the global stage. And David Cameron, a controversial appointment as Foreign Secretary, I know, but appears to be doing a decent job. He's getting himself about, he's speaking to all the right people. He's actually doing what it said on the tin, which is he is able, as a former Prime Minister, to get into places that other foreign secretaries perhaps wouldn't be able to. So those are the sort of in the pro list for Sunak and a turnaround and a better performance moving forward.
I was wondering where that was going. Are you suggesting a second coming for David Cameron?
Not at all.
In an emergency?
He'd have to get a seat, and there aren't many safe seats at the moment looking at that phone and everything. So no, I'm not suggesting that. But what I am saying is that those are all positive things that Sunak could potentially point to by the time we get to April, by the time we get to Easter, and say, look, things are moving in the right direction. However, if inflation continues to be stuck at around 4%, if interest rates do not come down, and there's no sign yet that the Bank of England are ready to play the game of reducing interest rates significantly, at least, so people are still feeling those big mortgage payments coming out of their bank accounts, and it's difficult. The cost of living crisis is still a very real thing. And if people actually are focused more on the domestic situation, and let's even throw immigration in there, because this Rwandan policy, again, all the polling suggests people think it's an okay idea, but equally, more people don't think it's going to work. Then you get really bad election results. You lose the mayoralty in Teesside, you lose the mayoralty of the West Midlands. The big high-profile mayoral contest, of course, is London. Again, the Tory candidate's fucking hopeless in London, so she ain't gonna. I don't think she's going to wash a dish in terms of coming close to Sadiq Khan. So we then get to a situation. I'm labouring the point a little, but I'm trying to lead you to this conclusion, James. The Parliamentary Conservative Party think this fella's done. He's absolutely no chance he's going to lead us to a catastrophic defeat. And within that parliamentary party, there are still more conservative mainstream Tories than there are Spartans. Take the opportunity to ditch Sunak and put in somebody who is a bit more mainstream, let's say, if I can use that word. Maybe Jeremy Hunt, but maybe somebody else from that sort of wing of the party, and see if they can at least stop as big a loss as they seem to be facing at this moment of time. And you say to your party membership, of course, look, it's too late to do a campaign. So the MPs are going to select the new Prime Minister. That's sort of one of the things that listen, it's all to play for at the moment, but it potentially could happen.
but that's desperate stuff. I mean, the idea that Jeremy Hunt would inspire the nation as a successor. You see, and this is the problem. Who in the moderate centre? I mean, it was an astute analysis is always from you, but who is there in the centre ground who would make that transformation? The contenders are likely to be from the right. Braverman, Badenoch from the sort of hard right, really. Penny Mordaunt, slightly more reasonable.
Penny Mordaunt would be a good shout, a much better shout than Jeremy Hunt, I have to say.
I mean, I have to. I'll just say this: the situation you pose would be so dire that there are only a couple of people who I think could make that summer transformation in the fortunes of the Tory party. Unfortunately, both of them are out of Parliament. They are Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. Those two people, we don't agree with their politics. The people listening to this know that. We think they're the badly damaged British politics. But those are the only two people who could make that dynamic change, and they're not available. I think your Mordaunt's and your Hunts, it wouldn't make that much difference. And you've got to think that the act of changing again, you've got to weigh that up against doing it. And just one last thing, you are right to raise all this, because for a long time Sunak was ahead of his party. He was more popular than his party, and that was an asset and a buttress to him. That has dissipated. I think he's probably less popular than his party, or around about the same now. From a strategist point, I mean, you're right to raise how desperate it is, but I don't think you come up with a leader that I think would make the difference during the summer. I mean, leadership is important, and who's the Prime Minister is important, but the underlying things that are doing down the Conservatives are the one we've always said is the most important. Do you feel better off? The answer is no. But other things are popping up. I mean, this post office scandal, there's an important story broken today that there was a minister's representative in a meeting where the cover-up of Horizon's difficulties was revealed, and it was just, they were in on the cover-up. So there's going to be over the next few days, on Monday, there'll have to be a statement in the Commons. So these things keep on happening. It's a dire situation. But you may be right. I mean, what the last 10 years of politics have told us, Frank, is that whatever we predict doesn't happen. So you're entitled to speculate.
David Gauke suggests that actually all of this noise is to eventually just pin the blame on Sunak for the inevitable election defeat, which then does line up a contest where the right of the party can say, we told you so. If you'd have been more right-wing, if you'd have gone more towards the reform agenda, then we'd have potentially won and certainly wouldn't have been as damaged as we're going to. This is, again, accepting that this landslide is a reality. And you and I discussed at length last week as to why that actually is unlikely, given the political terrain we find ourselves in, with Labour needing a 12.7% swing to win by one seat, never mind win by a landslide. So Gauke's view is they're trying to pin defeat on Sunak, and this is all about the next leadership contest within the Tory party post the general election. And if that's the case, if you've already sort of indicated, Jim, the favourites will come from the hard right of the party. So my money will go on Badenoch at the moment, to be fair. I think she's playing a canny game. I don't think Braverman has got the support. I think Jenrick's a joke. So I think Badenoch will be the credible candidate. That is for another day in a sense, but what I wanted to put to you, and again, really interesting interview I listened to earlier this week with David Steele. Do you remember him? He was the Gang of Four at one point, ended up as the Gang of One. The youngest foreign secretary under a Labour government back in the mid-70s, went on to establish the Social Democratic Party, and then when the SDP merged with the Liberal Democrats, he walked away, formed his own party, but was still very influential within the geopolitical world, actually has an incredible network of connections. And he was suggesting that should the Tories take that route, he thinks the Conservative Party will split. Could you potentially see that? as a conclusion to this sorry state of a decade of Tory politics, which have been chaotic, Jim?
Well, Conservative Party have been in existence since the boy from Bury, Sir Robert Peel, broke away from the old Tory party of the Corn Laws in the 1840s. So I'd be very reluctant to predict the Conservative Party breaking up. It's always managed to come together again. But, it's very interesting what you say. If they're rehearsing their blame game ahead of the election, then really they are going to condemn themselves to 2 or 3 terms in opposition, even with Sir Keir Starmer having a very difficult inheritance, because we saw this play out to some extent in 1997. William Hague, who was not then the sort of benign guy who appears on Times Radio with his rich Yorkshire voice, but he was seen as a sort of right-wing young champion. He abysmally failed in 2001. Did the Conservatives learn their lesson? No. They got the quiet man who was turning up the volume, Ian Duncan Smith. He failed. Then, as a slight improvement, we had Michael Howard, the man of something of the night about him. He failed in 2005. So, you can go into this thing and you can elect a right-wing leader, and I'm not saying Kimmy Badenoch wouldn't eventually succeed, but, you're likely to be painting a picture like that. It's very interesting. And just one last thing, and it's a theme of my blog this week, that one of the huge issues that antagonizes the right is that Hunt isn't more bullish on tax cuts. I'm interested in your view on this. I think the nation's not going to be particularly impressed in March by tax cuts because they can see that the public services are on their knees. I mean, there was an emergency budget grants to local authorities this week, woefully inadequate. But it just shows you, the crisis that's going on there. And people surely can see that, if you're going to have a tax cut, you want to be asking the tax cutters, so what is the implication for that for public services? The only last thing I would say is, while I was in Westminster with a very senior Labour MP, saying the problem for us is that people have lost faith in throwing money at the public services, and that it won't make much difference. So it's a slightly complex issue, but I don't know what you think, but I don't think there's a mood for better public services one way or another, isn't there?
I'm not sure about the appetite for tax cuts. I mean, we are, listen, even if he cuts tax in the way he's suggesting, we will still remain as being highly taxed higher than we have been since the war. So the headline for Labour is still, look, you're still being taxed until you pipsqueak. And the big message that Labour need to get out is that would be fine if the public services were improving, infrastructure was improving. And of course, we know it isn't in terms of all of the things that you look at across the country at the moment. It's broken, whether you're talking about the railway system, the roads, the bus services, none of these things are working particularly well. And then you come to the really big institutions, which we've always been proud of in the UK. National Health Service in particular, well, it's on its knees. And then, of course, education. Again, you talk to school teachers, school governors now, and there are some desperate stories out there in terms of the state of some of the schools, never mind, the educational attainment. So I think that there is an appetite for tax cuts, but not what I'm saying, I suppose, is that I don't think the Conservatives will get any credit for that, because we've had 14 years of austerity. They've broken everything. And the tax increases are something that wouldn't be addressed in one budget. Of course, what Hunt will signal is he sees this as the direction of travel. So there's going to be a continuous list of tax cuts to come. And that's where we need a bit of leadership from the opposition. And that's where the opposition needs to start to say, well, that's all very well and good, but if you can't see a GP, if you can't get your kid into a decent school, if you can't drive your car without hitting about 50 or 60 potholes on your half an hour journey, then what's the good of tax cuts? Because you're going to be paying, it's knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. The problem with that is that this moment in time, I'm not hearing those messages come from Rachel Reeves and the opposition Treasury spokesman. They seem to be saying, spokespeople, sorry, they seem to be saying, well, if the Tories cut taxes, we'll match it.
I can't believe that. I mean, the left in the party, the patience of, you may not think they've shown much patience, but I think the patience of the left in the party would be severely strained if Rachel Reeves has to get up and say, we'll match it. I mean, they're already in trouble over cutting back on this 38 billion. The only third way through this, tax cuts versus better public services, is the Wes Streeting model. Wes is in relation to his responsibilities with the health service, has an interesting case, which is, we all love the health service, but we are critical friends. And, efficiency in the public sector, in actual delivery, and we haven't got time this morning to discuss working from home, which I think is becoming a real factor in the failure to deliver public services. But I not much expectation the Labour government would be tough on that. But nevertheless, it's the Streeting model of looking at all our public services critically. That is a sort of interesting third way between this dilemma of tax cuts and public expenditure.
I think there is no doubt that public services are in need of reform, but that doesn't mean to say that the under-resourcing, particularly I would suggest now of local authorities, is not an issue that, if not addressed, will just see a further deterioration of the services that we all rely upon. And of course, when you talk about the health service in isolation and you don't then address local government cuts, actually you're having a false conversation and a false debate, because public health is the responsibility of local government. Local government
social care.
Social care
is a huge one.
And I'll move further than that, Jim, and I'll talk about crime, and I'll talk about youth services, and I'll talk about housing and the conditions that some people are having to live in. And so this whole thing, as I say, you can't take a particular service in isolation and say, well, we can reform that, make it better, and things will start to improve. You've got to look at this in the whole. And in the whole means local government reform as well. And in my view, and I think you'd have some sympathy with this, it means accelerating and progressing devolution and giving Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Andy Street, or perhaps his successor, the tools to do the job, to start to address those huge gaps now that we have in terms of public services and infrastructure. And I think Labour needs to start to make that case. I think Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves may think, yeah, we'll make that case, but we'll wait until we've got the keys to number 10, until we start to lay that out before the electorate. Very difficult, though, to start to make sort of radical plans, radical promises after you've won an election, if people haven't been sort of outlined with that proposal and that plan and that agenda. So my view is they should be making that argument. My gut instinct tells me unlikely that they're going to do so.
Yeah, it is. It would be an interesting prospect, actually, for Rachel to pull off her mask after she becomes Chancellor and say, actually, I'm a high spender, put a penny on income tax, let's get going. But do you think that would be too much of a long-term gamble?
Well, we say this, Jim, but, again, that we live in different times, don't we? So you've got the Prime Minister now standing up and berating the House of Lords, saying it's the will of the people to get this Rwandan policy. Well, there was no mention within the Conservative manifesto of a Rwandan policy. It was just an idea that Johnson thought sounded good. It was a decent soundbite. Telegraph got behind it. And there you go. Similarly, HS2 and the commitment to HS2 was within the Conservative manifesto, and Sunak scrapped it. So, party politics now, or party manifestos now, and the narrative that is used in the run-up to a general election and what parties do and governments do afterwards, well, might not be to your and I liking, but actually it seems to be not worth the paper it's written on.
Yeah. No, you could be right. HS2 is coming back, apparently. There's attempts to get businessmen to finance it.
Well,
Sunday Express.
watch this space. I think, again, Andy Street and Andy Burnham have some interesting conversations about this. And, I don't say this flippantly. I do think over the next decade, we are going to see the regional voices emerge as genuine powerhouses within the UK, because unless and until we start, as I say, to give those guys and girls the levers of power to get genuine investment into the areas that they represent, then the country is going to remain broken. And I think that, there's a number of people now who have started to wake up and smell the coffee as far as that's concerned. Sooner that happens, the better.
Street and Burnham might be behind this talk about reviving HS2 in some form.
It's fairly public. I think both of them have said, they're quite happy to talk to the private sector about getting funding in, because, again, we don't want to go back into the HS2 debate at length, but I will say very quickly that if you talk to entrepreneurs, business people in Birmingham, they will say to you, they want the link to Manchester. Getting to London an hour faster and a bit better capacity, of course, is okay. It's nice to have, but the real benefit, and certainly the real benefit to UK PLC, is the link north. And so it's natural, I think, that Andy Burnham and Andy Street will be having those conversations. And the key thing here is that you've now got leaders who are taken seriously on the international stage, who can actually go and have those negotiations and do the business as far as that's concerned. That's why I'm saying, if you want to fix all of these problems that we've talked about at length on this podcast over the last few months, you do need to have serious devolution. And Starmer was in Manchester on the 10th of January. Some of our members were in the room, and he had very warm conversations with Andy Burnham and was saying, this is the way in which we need to start to fix our country, working with people like Andy Burnham to get stuff delivered. So
that's why that's why the downtown conference next month is important and contributing to that discussion.
Absolutely. 8th of February, everybody, in the Lowry Hotel. Some great speakers. I'll tell you about that in the break, perhaps. And the final point I want to make on this first part of the discussion that we've had today, because we've got onto the Labour Party and what they might do about some of the problems that the country faces. But of course, none of that will be of interest to Rishi Sunak. He will still be determined to go on and win this general election. If you were his advisor and you wasn't one of those that felt as though you needed to resign and go off and work to oust him, what are the sort of things that you think he needs to be doing between now and, let's say, May, to make his position more tenable?
Well, I mean, in a way, he needs to concentrate on the economy. Basically, what he shouldn't start doing is panicking and having speeches. I mean, it was like in the autumn at the party conference talking about smoking bans and things like that. There's a temptation always to try and reach for another idea and another idea as well. Remember Jeremy Corbyn in the middle of the general election campaign suddenly made a huge announcement, an uncosted announcement. There's always this temptation by politicians to try and reach for a headline. I think his only, I would advise him to, within his own terms, to keep looking for shoots of recovery in the economy, and there are some signs of that. This week's Prime Minister's questions were very nasty and personal. I always thought that Sunak's, one of his virtues was slightly rising above things. I mean, he's not a politician, as we know. Yeah. And getting down into the political gutter doesn't really suit him. He needs to try and reestablish this a nice guy image, that image of him carrying the plates of food around during the Eat Up to Get Back or whatever it was called.
Trying to put petrol in his car.
Yeah, I don't have any dramatic suggestions for him, because I think if I made a dramatic suggestion, it's exactly what the public would see through it. So I think he's trapped in a way, and the clock is ticking down, and the ticking clock gets louder. That would be my rather uncolourful advice.
I think it's not far away from what I'd say to him, which is, Rishi, you need to be more Rishi and stop pandering to the right, because it doesn't matter how much you tack to their politics, how much you run towards reform, you are never going to be able to satisfy that rump of 60 within your parliamentary party. Your membership doesn't like you anyway. They didn't elect you. Only 40%, I think it was, maybe less, got behind him in that contest with the letters. Sorry, not the letters, Liz Truss. And, stop trying to impress those people, because you need to start to talk to the country rather than to those 60 people and keep those happy.
Do you remember during the Brexit row, Ken Clarke, in reference to the Spartans on the ultra hardline Brexiteers, said it's all very well feeding buns to the crocodile, but what happens when you run out of buns?
Yeah, well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, somebody else used an analogy a couple of days ago. It said, a dog, you can feed a dog as much as you like, but it'll always want more food. And it's exactly the same with this. The self-proclaimed Spartans, fuck me. And, as I say, the more that Sunak panders to those people, the less popular he has become. I mean, that is the message he should be taking from this polling. 12 months ago, his particular standings as an individual and as Prime Minister were really healthy. He was ahead of Keir Starmer. 12 months later, as he's gone down this rabbit hole of Rwanda, as he started to talk about tax cuts over economic growth and efficiency, as he started to get into what I call gesture politics and attacking the woke agenda. We're going to come on to a bit more of that in the second part of today's podcast. But his popularity has started to wane, and therefore you would think that somebody within his team and he himself would think this just isn't working. This strategy, whatever it is, just isn't working. I need to go back to, as I say, Rishi being Rishi.
And Starmer's position is dull but decent. And it's the same advice to Starmer. If he starts to try and go down the sort of trendy route, it won't work. It's not glamorous, but that is what, against this Tory psychodrama, Sir Keir Starmer is posing as he wouldn't say he was dull, but dull and decent is quite a respectable political strategy against this psychodrama going on the other side.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, listen, this is a story we're going to continue to follow. I'm sure it's one that we'll come back to in a future episode of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. We're going to be back in a mo talking about Jim's former bosses, the BBC, and Donald Trump. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, and Jim Hancock. And we were talking in the first part of the programme about Rishi Sunak's woes. Well, it seems that Jim's former bosses at the BBC can't go a week without some sort of controversy following them. And this week, they've been attacked for not being impartial, showing bias. The culture minister, I think her name's Lucy Fraser, went on to Sky News to berate the Beeb. But Kay Burley put her through quite a rigorous interview, asking her on several occasions to just give one example of where she felt the BBC had been biased. She was unable to do so, but came with this marvellous phrase, Jim, that the perception is the BBC is biased. Now, listen, you were an employee there for a long time. What do you make of the controversies that follow this, I think, still magnificent institution, but as I say, one that does seem to be embroiled increasingly in controversy?
Well, the big answer is that the BBC is a huge and complex organisation, obviously with 4 television channels, 4 radio services, a network of local radio services, which it doesn't value as much as it should, in my opinion, regional programmes, the World Service, a big drama producer, big education producer, and it is a huge organisation. From time to time, it makes the most colossal blunders and shoots itself in the foot. But I'm mentioned that in connection with the size of the organisation, because it would be surprising if it didn't make mistakes. It's constantly in the eye of the public in a way in which most organisations aren't, because it's in our homes every day of the week. It is critical to our news coverage. It is the national broadcaster. Still, we see that when it comes to state funerals and coronations and things like that, we look to the BBC, and it has a lot of programs that we've loved over the years. But it's also, the tension between politicians and the BBC is a very long standing. And it was only 4 years old in the 1926 general strike when Winston Churchill was outraged that it was broadcasting the Labour Party's point of view on the general strike and thought it should be a state broadcaster. So all this goes on that Harold Wilson had huge run-ins with the BBC. And we've now come to this point. That the difference now is that with so many alternatives to the BBC, the question of how it's funded is going to become an increasingly controversial subject. But that's perhaps what you may want to get onto that. But your central point is about the perception of bias. Nobody ever in my time in the BBC put their hand on my shoulder and said, rewrite that cue, Jim, do this interview in this particular way. You know what the BBC's line is. And that's generally felt to be of a sort of left of centre, wokish point of view. That's the general accusation, that the BBC is broadly left of centre, pro-Remain, pro-permissive society, all that sort of stuff. Nobody ever tried to influence me in any way, and therefore I do not believe that the BBC is institutionally biased in that way. However, journalism, the creative industries, tend to attract people of a particular type, liberally minded, generally speaking. There are right-wing people who are attracted to the cultural world, but to try and conduct this argument reasonably and try and meet the BBC's critics a little, I think the BBC always has to be vigilant that the majority of people that are working for it, actors, journalists, people behind the screen and so on, there will be a preponderance of people with a particular attitude to life. And I think that's what is picked up by the BBC's critics, some of which are well motivated, some of which, particularly the Mail and the Telegraph, are ridiculously biased. Every single day they're pointing up some minor misdemeanor because, I presume, they want to abolish the BBC for commercial reasons, because the BBC takes revenue away from them because eyeballs are on the BBC's websites and things like that. Sorry, very long answer, Frank, but that's my comprehensive view of all this.
I suppose that where the BBC finds itself on the wrong side of the headlines is when some of its presenters, Gary Lineker being probably the most notable, take to social media and make political statements. Now, in your day, Jim, you still have the Abacus, never mind. No Twitter and no LinkedIn. I was going to ask you earlier when you were talking about Robert Peel, what he was like to interview, but we'll come back to that another time. But listen, it is more challenging now. Serious point. It's more challenging, isn't it, for any broadcaster to keep a grip on every single person that does a program for them. And Lineker plays the game quite well, I think. He says, well, listen, the BBC pay me to present a program, but I'm still allowed my own sort of personal views. I sometimes wince when I see some of the BBC journalists tweet in a way that I think is offering an opinion rather than simply reporting the news. That appears to have been something that happens more frequently. But in the BBC's defence, journalists from every other broadcaster does that as well. So they are between a rock and a hard place. Do you go with what apparently the vast majority of viewers, listeners want these days? Or do you say, well, no, we're just going to say, as a sort of stuffy organisation, pretend that social media doesn't exist and continue to report the way we did through the 50s, 60s, 70s? You know where I'm coming from. It is a challenge for them.
Yes, and I'll say two things now and be highly controversial, and then just see what you've got to say about it. I think Gary Lineker's latest retweet calling for Israel to be banned from international football, I think that's what he retweeted, didn't he? I think that is a step too far. I know he is not a journalist. I know he's on a contract with the BBC, is not on the staff. But if you are trying to tell your staff that you can't do that sort of thing, you've got this freelance presenter continually provoking actually the management of the BBC. And I half anticipated that the BBC would say after the Israel retweet, thank you very much indeed, Gary. There are other people that can, I mean, I think his job is slightly overrated, actually. I can think of one or two people I'd like to see presenting Match of the Day. And I think that should have been the end point. And then the second bombshell I'll say is that I was always really apprehensive, because it used to be, as I understand it, after my time, a point of productivity that you show in your performance review, how much you got involved in this new medium of tweeting. And particularly for journalists, once you enter the wild west of X and things like that, it is a different world. And you're quite right. You are going to inevitably, you can't go on to X and say, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and the BBC policy is this. You start getting dragged into answering points and displaying your own opinions. I think it was fraught with danger. And I know you've put it already, ignore the modern world. But I would effectively ban, particularly BBC journalists, from participating in X. I can't see that it's not. It doesn't. Well, it does lead, because the papers are looking for it all the time. I can't see it's not going to cause trouble. So sack Lineker and ban tweeting. So there we are.
Interesting. Now, when we talk about bias by the BBC, it's inevitably almost accepted that it's left-wing bias. And this is where I fall out with Lucy Fraser and this nonsensical evidence that she gave to Kay Burley. The perception is the BBC is biased. Well, it went, I think that evidence was based on a poll that was undertaken by Ofcom. And I think the percentage was, I may be wrong, but I think it was in its 40% something. So still the majority of people think the BBC is impartial. If you ask me that question, I would say I recognise bits of the BBC that, in my opinion, are not impartial. But I would not say that because of any woke agenda that they're trying to promote. I would say that because they gave a guy called Nigel Farage a huge platform for many, many years. I think he appeared more times on Question Time than any other person outside of Ken Clarke. I hesitate to call the man a politician. He was on Question Time dozens and dozens of times, talking the shite that he was spouting about Brexit and so on. And that led to, at least in part, to the issue being given the sort of oxygen it was given, and we know where that ended up. I would also then point to an alarming story that I heard on another podcast this week, and I'm amazed that this hasn't been picked up by other media outlets. The BBC has a board of governors, one of whom is a guy called Robbie Gibb. Robbie Gibb was a former spin doctor for Theresa May, was knighted by Theresa May, and then did some work, I understand, for Boris Johnson, as I say, being appointed to the BBC governing body. Now, again, back in your day, Jim, the governors would have zero input into editorial output. Rightly so. because they all have political views and often are political appointees. A journalist this week said that he was contacted by one of his producers or editors suggesting that Robbie Gibb had been, let me word this correctly, displeased with the coverage that the Beeb was giving, this particular journalist was giving, to Partygate without taking more interest in the Beergate or the Keir. Do you remember when Keir Starmer it was suggested that he'd broken the law by having a pint in Durham? Now, that is definitely biased, in my opinion. And that is serious, Jim, because that is the BBC's editorial policy being influenced by members of a board appointed by the government. And that, by the way, I would make that criticism if it was, say, for example, Alistair Campbell, who decided that he was just going to reach out through a producer to say, I'm not happy with your news coverage. It's outrageous, Jim. And I think that we do need to seriously look at our appointment system, independence, how we protect that, because, as I say, I couldn't sit here now and say, I think the BBC is impartial, but I'm looking at it through the lens of my politics.
Yes, I don't know about the Robbie Gibb thing. All I would say is that very recently we saw the mechanisms of power play out with the BBC chairman, wasn't it, Richard Sharp?
Mm.
Now, he was perceived to have been too close to Boris Johnson and was quickly out the door. So, you know, these things can be dealt with. But no, I mean, the Board of Governors should stay out of things. But I'm probably being a bit too relaxed about this. I mean, going back on my history, I mean, there was a huge row when Harold Wilson appointed a man called Lord Hill, who was one of his own as chairman of the BBC. You know, the idea is that whatever political background they have before they go onto the board, that they leave that at the door. And if what you're saying is true, then Robbie Gibbs not leaving it at the door, or I mean, you know, he could voice it possibly in the privacy of a governor's meeting, I suppose, but not let it leak out to outside sources so that you know about it now.
Well, the final point I'll make on this is I'm having a moan about the BBC, and I will consider myself to be sort of centre-left. And then you've got Lee Anderson, who is on the right, moaning about the BBC. Then it's probably getting things just about right. So we'll leave that discussion there and we'll see what comes along over the future months, because the BBC, as I say, is never far away from controversy these days, has unfortunately, I think, found itself in the crossfire of what we sort of glibly call these days the woke wars. And another person who has made a political career on woke wars had a good week this week, unfortunately, I would say. Over in the States, across the pond, he won New Hampshire, the nomination for New Hampshire as the Republican Party candidate for president. That, of course, is the infamous Donald Trump. Jim, 99 indictments or not, he's on his way to at least being the candidate to face, it looks like, Joe Biden in sort of presidential runoff of the geriatrics.
Yeah, only 90? Bring on some more. I would like 110 indictments. It is an extraordinary dynamic has been set up. I mean, a year ago, he'd had some pretty bad midterm elections. A lot of his candidates hadn't succeeded. DeSantis was going to sweep him aside, and the indictments were going to bring him down. But the more the indictments have come on, his popularity has been regained. This line that he's being persecuted, not prosecuted. As far as the situation is concerned, I mean, Nikki Haley's hoping to fight on into her own state of South Carolina, where she was the governor, in a couple of weeks' time. But, you know, that will depend on funding. I mean, you saw Ron DeSantis disappear, and that will be because the funders have said there's no point in going on with this. I think Nikki Haley wants really now to be putting down a marker for 2028. And when I finally established, I should have known this all along, that Trump cannot stand again. I wondered whether you could get 2 terms if they were, your first term was discounted if you had broken service. But this is the last 4 years of Trump. So in 2028, there will be a fresh Republican candidate. No, I think he is absolutely master of the Republican Party, that he will be the candidate. And as things are going at the moment, since we last discussed this, I've tried to dig down a bit into why President Biden is not popular on the economy, because I thought he was doing quite well with his infrastructure and all that sort of thing. But apparently, people are still not feeling much better off. They've got problems with the gas prices still, and obviously his age is a huge problem. So I think if I was having to have a bet now, I think it'll be President Trump being inaugurated next January, and presumably he'll say that the election was fairly won.
Well, yes, and listen, there's a long way to go between now and that presidential election in November, and I've seen some quite interesting polling on the back of the New Hampshire result, which will give me some optimism if I was a Democrat, if I can put it that way. And what is absolutely clear, and Nikki Haley, I thought, great line in her sort of concession speech in New Hampshire the other night. The first party to get rid of its 80-year-old candidate will actually win the presidency. And I thought, as I say, that was a great line. And of course, the other thing that started to happen, I don't know if you saw this, Jim, but Trump was mistakenly naming Nikki Haley as Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi, very well-known Democrat, was the leader of the House for many, many years. A real rival to Trump, as I say, a Democrat. But he was confusing the two. And so this senility, which has been aimed at Biden, I thought there was a wonderful advert that the Biden camp produced with all of Trump's slip-ups and mistakes. And he sort of turned it round and he's saying, look, this is the guy who's actually senile and keeps getting things wrong. So I thought that was quite interesting. I think Trump is in danger of, a few more slips like that, and he does start to look as though he's in the same bracket and camp as Biden. I know physically he looks stronger, but at the end of the day, mentally, you can start to point out to these slips, then it certainly doesn't do him any favours. And the other thing that I think may just be in the Democrats' favour, you've mentioned the economy there, and you're right, it's not cut through as yet, but really good news this morning that has been reported on the American economy. And listen, over the next few months, it's been far more successful, the American bounce back in growth, than the UK and Europe. That might actually start to make a difference. But I'm with you, Jim. If I was a Democrat in the States, I would be doing all I could to persuade Joe Biden to stand down and put a candidate up against Trump who would wipe the floor with him. Because the one thing, again, that all the polling evidence shows is that what Americans want is a fresh face, a new direction, somebody who can actually take on the modern day challenges of 2024, 2025 and beyond. And they don't actually see Biden or Trump as the answer to that. And that's a very understandable position for them to take. But if we are looking seriously at President Trump, what does that mean for the geopolitical situation? Because we have never been, since the Second World War, I would suggest, in as perilous state as we are with global affairs at this moment in time. Middle East conflict, of course, Ukraine. There's wars, actually, and disputes all over the planet at this moment in time. What would a President Trump bring to that particular debate and discussion, do you think?
Let me once again draw on my history knowledge. in the 10 years between sort of 1904 and 1914, the world became destabilized. In the 1930s, the world became destabilized. And what was common to those 2 decades? The absence of the United States from the international stage. Before 1914, it was still a young country. In fact, it had a fairly small army. I mean, it wasn't a military power. But in the 1930s, having participated in the First World War, it went into isolationism. And try as Franklin Roosevelt might, he could not resist the forces of isolationism. And of course, in 1914 and in 1939, we all knew what happened. Now, I don't want to be too apocalyptic about it all, but I must say, again, when I was at the huddle of journalists with the Prime Minister's spokesman on Wednesday in the Commons, there was this discussion about this, the general saying, we need
conscription.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And then somebody else saying, a war with Russia is possible. I mean, all this is very speculative and on the background, but you're quite right to point to the dangerous international situation. And coming to your point, we would have a president who seems to me is in tune with that historical position of the United States not being the world's policeman. He'd be playing on a feeling that's deeply embedded in Americans. I mean, it's both. Well, I mean, in the time of the Vietnam War, it was to do with the tragedy of American soldiers dying in faraway countries of which they knew little. Now it's more economic, and it's a powerful argument amongst Republicans and perhaps even wider. Why is the United States the world's policeman if in Europe, a lot of the countries are spending less than 2% of their budgets on defense? So at best, I think Trump will lay down a gauntlet to NATO, demanding an immediate increase in defense contributions. And in the context of everything we've been talking about earlier on about public services and taxes in this country, 3-4% on defense would have huge implications. But I think that would be the challenge. And what he would actually do about Ukraine, I think I've said to you before. He might well say to Putin, keep what you've got, but don't be a naughty boy anymore. You can have the parts of the country you've conquered. I mean, that could be my only interpretation. When he says I can sort that out in a day, I mean, it's an absurd thing to say. But I mean, you could imagine where Putin would actually buy that deal. I mean, it would outrage the Ukrainians, of course, feel deeply betrayed and so on. But that could be my only interpretation of that. But whether he's going to extend that to the Chinese, because if he's going to withdraw into isolation, is that an invitation to China to try and conquer Taiwan and the United States, which has always preserved this sort of ambiguity as to whether it would defend Taiwan or not? That's where you get into more serious territory. And I have no idea what his views are on the two-state solution. He provocatively backed Israel by moving the American embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. So I have no idea, but it would be a radical change. I mean, the Brexiteers might say that the chances of getting a Brexit treaty with the United States might be improved. But we've just seen what's happened with the Canadian negotiations, so I don't know about that. No, it would be a very uncertain world, and with only 4 years left in office, no need to worry about re-election. This is what the Biden people have got to rely on, that this guy could go out of control, do all sorts of things to judiciary, pardoning people who stormed the Capitol, all sorts of stuff. And I think that's what the Biden campaign will focus on, is don't let this dangerous man into the White House.
Of course, the president is not, it's not in the gift of him to do a trade deal with the United Kingdom. And I always remind Brits that Ireland is a far more influential nation than the UK when it comes to the Senate and the House of Representatives and the people who are actually negotiating these trade deals. And I'm afraid that a trade deal with the United Kingdom will be at the bottom of any new president's interest. So it's for the birds to suggest that there'll be a trade deal with the US anytime soon. And I don't say that with any joy, because it would, of course, give a great boost to our economy. But we knew it was bollocks when the Brexiteers were saying it, and so it has proved. A couple of other points I'll make, Jim, because, we talk about Ukraine, and I think that it's 2 years next month that conflict has now been raging. Some terrible losses on both sides, actually. I think the Russians have possibly lost more men and young women because of the nature, again, conscription. The Russian army obviously has been decimated. They've lost an awful lot of army, but nonetheless, because of the size of that country in comparison to Ukraine, then the drying up of support, largely from America, but also less enthusiasm from Europe, other than the UK, actually. The rest of Europe has gone quite soft, I think, in terms of this particular conflict. And if I may play devil's advocate for a moment, I'm not sure Zelensky's helped himself in that regard, because I think the initial reaction from the world was Russia have got no right to go into this place and try and invade and take over. But then Zelensky's own agenda seemed to become more ambitious, more robust, and he started talking about taking back Crimea, which was a war fought and lost in 2014. Now, there may be some really great reasons and rationale for Zelensky to be saying that, but I don't think it was the message that Europeans and other allies wanted to hear. And now, of course, because they failed in terms of this offensive that was supposed to be happening through the winter, where they would start to take back a lot of the land that the Russians had taken, people are starting to see that there is no potential way to victory for Ukraine. And therefore, at some point, Trump or whoever might well be saying to the Ukrainians, we do need to negotiate a settlement here. And that would be my point on Ukraine. I don't think that this is something that can go on for very much longer for everybody's sakes. But even if Biden was to win another term of office, you have made this comment yourself, and I think it's absolutely right. There is no appetite amongst the American public, whatever their political persuasion, to continue to pour money into a war that they don't think is winnable.
Well, I hear what you say. I mean, can we reach agreement that if, with great reluctance, a peace deal was done whereby the eastern part of Ukraine was given up, which would be a very serious matter, that we've succumbed to military conquest, that Ukraine be immediately admitted to NATO, so as to ensure that the Russians know beyond peradventure that any more adventures in Ukraine, and they would be in for a NATO response. I mean, would you think that was reasonable?
Yes, probably, but I do think that if you look at the wider conversation, I'm going back decades now, since '89, and the agreements that were reached just after with Gorbachev and so on, we did come to what were known at the time as gentlemen's agreements. And we did say that we weren't going to start to ask Poland and Romania and, the Eastern Bloc to join the EU and become westernized. And so we sort of chipped away and chipped away and chipped away. We continued to poke the Russian bear. And, a lot of people that are on perhaps the other side of the argument that you and I will be, Jim, and as I say, I'm playing devil's advocate here, would say that it was inevitable Putin would eventually invade Ukraine because he was genuinely concerned that the West were getting closer and closer to his borders. And we may see the West as the good guys, but of course, President Putin doesn't. And so, as you're saying, it's time to say to Putin, this is the line in the sand, enough is enough. He would say, and his supporters and allies would say to you, well, that's what I'm saying to you, pal. I'm saying enough is enough. You've taken Poland, you've taken Romania, you've taken most of Eastern Europe into your Western alliance. And now I'm saying to you, no more. You are not taking Ukraine as well, because that is part of, historically, Russia. And that's the conundrum, isn't it? That's the, how far do you go in terms of saying to countries, come into the West, we're wonderful, we're the good guys, without actually starting to create these conflicts that inevitably and always lead to millions of lives being lost.
Well, I mean, you're right to say to make us look at things from Putin's point of view, but I just don't find it acceptable that Latvia and Romania and those other countries in the 1990s were not allowed to use their democratic will to join an economic organization which posed no threat to Russia at all. I don't recognise, that Russia should have this overweening influence over half of Europe, saying it's their sphere of influence. The question of whether Ukraine is part of Russia or not is a highly complex issue, but I suppose you're right. But what is true?
I'm not saying I'm right, Jim. I was putting the point of view that others would say, who would have some sympathy to the Russian cause. I'm not saying that they're sympathetic towards bombing buggery out of Ukraine and killing all those innocent people, but they would say, and you've heard people say this, Jim, and actually I've heard people whose political views on many other things are closer to mine, actually, that we did poke the bear, and we were stupid to do so.
Well, and
by the way, they will also tell you, and these are people who perhaps a bit more experienced in dealing with Ukraine than certainly I am. Ukraine wasn't the best run democracy in the world either. And, eyebrows would be raised within the corridors of Western powers to see some of the things that were happening within Ukrainian government and institutions. So that is the other side of that coin, I suppose.
Yes, but they didn't deserve military aggression. But
no, absolutely not.
Whatever the situation was with Ukraine, the huge irony of what Putin's done is to give them a sense of nationality and aversion to Russia that they possibly never had before. Putin would have been far better to try and woo Ukraine with economic advantages and things like that. That would have been the better approach. But what's certain now is that the rest of Ukraine will never want to be part of Russia again.
Mm. Yes, and I think if you look at the other issue, which we can't spend too much time on because we've overrun our hour already, I think. But in terms of the question you posed, Trump's attitude to the conflict in the Middle East, I understand he detests Netanyahu. I'm not sure where that comes from. I think there was a past spat, big fallout between the two. I think Netanyahu was one of the first world leaders to congratulate Joe Biden on his victory as new president 4 years ago. So other than the fact that there is that personal dislike, and that seems to play a large part in terms of what positions Donald Trump takes on these matters, I would think that two-state solution could still be part of the American sort of narrative. But we will see.
That's interesting. I mean, because, in some ways you'd think Netanyahu and Trump had similar traits. But the other thing is, of course, will Netanyahu be there by January next year?
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. It's a good point. But lots of things to play out as far as those geopolitics are concerned. There's enough to discuss, I suppose, just in terms of the UK. But we know how important America is to world affairs and, of course, to the United Kingdom as well. So I thought it was only fair to have sort of 15 minutes on the subject of what could potentially be a new presidency, a new President Trump in the White House come January of next year. God help us all. Anyway, James, listen, it's been fascinating to get your thoughts, your views on a whole range of things today. Hope you've enjoyed the second episode of our 2024 series of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. We'll be back next week. And on Monday, Jim and I will be in the House of Commons for Downtown's parliamentary reception. The last time we were there, Boris Johnson resigned as Prime Minister. Will Rishi Sunak survive a visit from downtown? He might get away with the Daily Telegraph being after him, Simon Clarke being after him, the Spartans being after him, but will he survive downtown in Parliament? We'll be back next week. We'll let you know, and we'll report back on some of the gossip that I'm sure we'll pick up whilst we're in the corridors of power. So that's it from me, Frank McKenna, Chief Executive Group Chairman of Downtown in Business, and Jim Hancock, our political commentator, for another week. Have a great 7 days. We'll see you very soon.